The year was 1874, and the wind had teeth that day, sharp and mean, dragging across the plains like it remembered every sin the land had buried. Winter had come early, with a spiteful hunger. Snow had not yet fallen, but the sky sagged low, gray as regret, heavy with the promise of it. Beau Coulter leaned into the wind, shoulders squared against it, every step down toward the creek carving a deeper ache into the muscles of his back. He walked like a man used to carrying more than feed or firewood. Like grief had weight, and he'd long since grown strong under it. He didn't expect to find her. Hell, he hadn't expected anything beyond his usual quiet, mending fences, checking the frozen pump, making it back before dusk swallowed the last of the light. But there she was, just beyond the bend in the creek, where the water thinned into icy breath, and the brush turned skeletal. A shape, small, crumpled, wrong against the earth. Beau stopped cold, boot soles biting into frozen dirt. He saw the bare feet first, bloodied, cracked. Then the hands, bound at the wrists by a rusted iron shackle. Her dress, or what was left of it, hung in ribbons, soaked and stiff with filth. Her cheek lay against a half-buried root, dark hair matted and trailing into the water. He might have thought her dead if not for the rise of her back, slight but sure. Something in him went still. He didn't call out, didn't ask what had happened or where she'd come from. Questions could wait. Snow wouldn't. He dropped to his knees beside her, careful, like she was fire that hadn't chosen whether to burn him yet. Her eyelids fluttered, slow as a dying moth. She didn't speak. He slipped his coat off and wrapped her in it, lifting her like he'd carried lambs in spring, fragile but alive. Her weight barely filled his arms. Still, she tensed, flinched even in half-consciousness. He murmured something low, no words, just sound. The kind a man makes when he don't know what else to offer but his presence. The wind pushed harder on the way back up the hill, as if it wanted to steal her right out of his arms. He held tighter. The cabin waited, plain and rough-hewn against the horizon, its windows blank, its chimney coughing smoke into the gray. Inside, the hearth gave off a low, reluctant heat. He laid her down on his bed, near the fire, on the side where the boards didn't creak as much. She stirred when he unwrapped the coat, instinct pulling her limbs tighter, eyes darting open. Fear crackled in them, not wild, but ancient, as though she'd had good reason not to trust the hands of men. He raised both palms and backed away. She watched him with the same quiet fury the land held in winter. She didn't speak, just stared, measuring him like he was another kind of storm. He left food on the table, a chunk of cornbread, a tin cup of water, and set about stoking the fire. His boots clunked heavy across the floorboards, but his silence was respectful. He didn't ask her name, didn't touch her again. Night settled thick, the kind that crept in through every crack. She didn't eat until he'd gone to the far side of the room and sat with his back against the wall, eyes on the fire, but ears on her. In the morning, she was still there, still watching. The days passed quiet. She never spoke, but she moved more each one. First to the chair by the fire, then to the table. She cleaned herself with a basin near the stove. Dressed in one of his old flannel shirts, sleeves rolled to her elbows. The bruises on her arms faded from purple to yellow. The red marks around her wrists remained like memories that hadn't yet healed. He worked outside mostly, splitting wood, fixing the paddock gate. She watched him from the window, eyes narrowed, unreadable. She moved like she was remembering how to live. On the third day, he came in with kindling in his arms and found the floor swept, the kettle boiling. She wasn't trying to please him. She just needed something to do with her hands. That night, he nodded toward the fire. Storm coming. She looked at him. Not long, not warm, just looked. He nodded to himself, as if her silence said enough. On the fifth day, he returned to find his old medicine tin laid open, her ankle bandaged in cotton. She'd found the ointment, used it with care. A woman used to doctoring herself. She still hadn't told him a thing, and maybe she didn't need to. Not yet. Beau remembered his mother's voice, not the words, just the tone, how it used to calm the dogs when storms rolled in. That same softness crept into his voice when he spoke around her, even if she didn't reply. He told her about the colt, that hadn't made it last spring, about the frost that got into the potatoes too early, about how his father used to sit on the porch with his rifle across his knees just because silence made him uneasy. Bo wasn't like him. Bo had made peace with silence. He just never expected it would sit across from him in the form of a girl with eyes like dusk and a mouth that hadn't spoken his name. On the seventh evening, as the wind howled and rattled the window panes, she stood from her place by the fire, walked to the table, poured water. Then softly, so soft it almost missed him, she spoke. "Juanilla." Her voice was rough, unused, but sure. He turned, slowly, let her see his face in full light. "Bo," he said, tapping his chest. "Coulter." She blinked, then, almost imperceptibly, nodded. A beat passed. Then another. She turned back to the fire, and though nothing more was said, something had changed. Not between them exactly, but around them, as if the room, once brittle with caution, had taken a breath and exhaled. Later that night, as she slept, he watched the fire throw shadows across her face. In its glow, the edges of her fear looked softer. Not gone, but softened. Outside, snow finally fell, soft flakes at first, then heavy, blanketing the land in hush. And in that hush, Bo Coulter realized he wasn't just housing a stranger. He was sheltering a story he didn't yet know. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't in a hurry to reach the end. The snow came quiet and slow, like a secret sliding through the sky. It blanketed the prairie until the world turned pale and still. Every sound softened. Every step Bo took outside his cabin sank into whiteness and left no echo. Inside, the fire whispered low, steady as a heartbeat. The girl, Juanilla, moved more now, though always lightly. Like her feet, still believed the ground might vanish. Bo watched without watching. He'd been raised by silence and wood smoke. He understood the way a soul needed time to trust the roof over its head. She didn't need his words, not yet. What she needed was consistency, the kind found in daily bread and a mended hinge, and someone who did not flinch at her stillness. Juanilla began to take up small spaces in the home, not in the way a storm invades, but how ivy grows, slow and patient. She swept the corners no man ever bothered with. She lined up the dry herbs along the sill, even though most had lost their scent. She sewed a rip in his shirt with fingers that trembled just once. Bo never asked her why she stayed. He didn't tell her to, either. Instead, he left his boots by the door. He spoke aloud when he fed the mule. He set a second cup at the table, even before she'd ever used the first. It was not affection, not yet. It was acknowledgement. That's how healing begins, with the small rituals of being seen. One morning, as gray light sifted through the frost-glazed windows, he found her by the hearth with a knife in hand. Not raised, not threatening, just slowly peeling apples he thought had long gone soft in the cellar. Her hands moved with practiced rhythm. She didn't look at him when he entered. She just said quiet and sure, "Wichienkala." He paused by the doorway. Her voice still carried that hoarse edge, like disuse had rusted it. "What's it mean?" he asked, not stepping closer. "Little girl," she answered, not smiling. "My brother called me that when I was younger." Bo let the silence stretch, not out of discomfort, but respect. He didn't press, just said, "He must have loved you." She didn't reply, but her shoulders didn't stiffen the way they used to, and that was answer enough. The days layered like the snow, thick and quiet. Routine wrapped around them like a quilt. Mornings meant kindling. Midday brought bread or beans. Evenings held the crackling fire, the long shadows, the hush of two lives coexisting. He spoke to her now more freely, not out of expectation, but out of habit. Told her about the coyote he saw skulking near the chicken coop, about the time his brother tricked him into eating a cricket stew, about how sometimes in the dead of night he still heard his mother humming, though she'd been gone over a decade. She listened, sometimes nodded, sometimes her lips twitched at the edges. When she answered, it came in pieces, shards of memory she didn't hand over so much as leave on the table beside him, like tokens worn smooth from too much handling. "My people used to follow the buffalo," she said once. Now they followed the train. He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and let the fire fill the room with something like warmth. Another night, while he carved a new spoon from cedar, she asked, "Why did you not leave me there at the river?" He didn't look up. "Because you were someone's daughter," he said, "and no one deserves to be left to die in the cold." She was quiet a long time, then whispered, "I was no one's anything. Not anymore." Bo set the spoon down. Let the ache of her words pass through him like wind through the chinks in the wall. "You still are," he said, "even if the world don't say so." She didn't answer. But the next day, he found the spoon polished and wrapped in linen, placed carefully on his pillow. Time moved in fits. Some days long and lonely, others short and sweet. Juanilla began to hum when she cooked. Not a song he recognized, but one that braided sadness and strength together like river reeds. One morning, he came in from hauling water to find her standing by the window. She was holding one of his father's books, an old leather-bound volume no one had touched since the funeral. She didn't seem to be reading, just touching the worn spine, the way one might trace a memory. He cleared his throat. "You read English?" "A little," she said. "More than the soldiers thought." Bo felt the weight of that simple truth. She turned the book over in her hands, gently. "Do you think your father would hate that I'm here?" He took off his hat, set it on the peg. "I think he'd hate that the world made you run," Bo said. "But he wouldn't have turned you away. Not once he saw your eyes." She didn't speak, but she left the book on the table, and later, after supper, he saw her glance at it again. They didn't speak of names or futures. That kind of thing required trust that came slow and careful, like thaw, like spring. One night, thunder growled beyond the hills. The sky bruised. Lightning cracked, so close the windows rattled. Juanilla stood by the door, her fists clenched, face pale. "Storms took our home," she whispered. "My mother's lodge caught fire. My sister ran, but the wind." Her breath caught. Bo didn't move toward her, just knelt slowly by the hearth, tossing on a log. "It's just wind now," he said, voice low. "This roof's old, but it's held through worse." She watched the fire flare. Then, without warning, she crossed the room and sat beside him. Close, but not touching. Just near enough that their shoulders shared heat. They stayed like that for a long while, the storm outside pacing like a hungry beast. Inside, there was only wood smoke and breath, and the slow uncoiling of something neither of them dared name. Later, as the fire dimmed, she said softly, "You don't ask me what happened." Bo stared into the coals. "You'll tell me when you want to." She nodded. Maybe not all, but maybe enough. That night, she didn't sleep on the bed. She took the floor beside it, curled in a blanket, her breathing even. She didn't ask permission. She didn't need to. And he let her be. Because healing wasn't about fixing. It was about waiting, watching, and offering a place where broken things could rest without being touched. As dawn broke pale and gold through the frost-rimmed panes, Bo stood at the doorway with his coffee, the steam curling like spirit smoke. He looked back at the woman sleeping near the hearth. Her fingers were curled loosely beneath her chin, face softened by dreams. And for the first time since that river day, he let the thought come. She wasn't just a guest anymore. She was beginning to belong. Winter began to loosen its grip, but it did not retreat kindly. The wind still howled some nights like it had bones to pick with the world. Ice lingered in the creases of the land, clinging to fence posts and railings like bitter memory. Yet the days stretched longer, sun-licked and hesitant. The land was preparing to forgive itself for another season of frost. Inside the cabin, things were shifting too, not all at once, but in slow, invisible ways. Juanilla had begun humming again, softer now, songs with no words, full of longing that curled around the rafters like smoke. She tended to the hearth like it was her own. She baked cornbread with firmer crusts, folded Bo's shirts without being asked. Some days, she even stepped outside, her feet making gentle prints through the melt and mud. Bo watched it all, unsure where care ended and affection began. He didn't speak of it. He merely moved slower when she was near, listened closer when she muttered to herself in Comanche, and always made sure the door creaked softly when he came home. And still, neither of them reached across the silence to name what lived between them. It wasn't time yet. Some things, like spring, can't be forced. It was the 6th Sunday, after her voice returned, that the trouble came riding. He saw them from the slope first, 4 figures on horseback, moving steady toward the ridge. One carried a lantern even in daylight, a sign not of necessity, but of declaration. The light bobbed with each hoofstep, as if carried by someone who wanted to be seen. Bo didn't call out. He just stepped down from the shed roof, where he'd been fixing shingles, and made his way to the porch. Juanilla had already seen them. She stood frozen by the window, her fingers wrapped tight around a dishcloth. The fabric twisted, like she was wringing out the very breath in her chest. He gave her a slow nod. It meant, "I see them." It meant, "Stay calm." The riders didn't come fast, but they came sure. The man in front wore a broad, clean coat and a look too polished for dirt roads. Bo recognized him, Sheriff Albin Keene. Behind him, 2 townsmen Bo knew by face, not by name. And a woman, tall, gray hair pulled tight into a braid, riding side saddle in a black wool cloak. Her hat had feathers stitched into the brim, the kind that said money and pride lived side by side. They stopped just short of the gate. "Coulter," the sheriff called, not unkindly, but with a warning tone, like a man announcing bad weather. "We'd like a word." Bo didn't move. "You're standing on my land, Keene. Word should come with good reason." Keene's horse pawed at the dirt. "There's talk," he said. "Talk that you're sheltering a native girl, a Comanche. Some say she was spotted tending your fire." Juanilla's breath hitched behind the door. Bo didn't look at her, just folded his arms. "She's no outlaw," he said. "Found her near dead in the riverbed. Ain't no crime to offer warmth." "Maybe not," the woman on the horse said sharply, her voice like iron pots rattling in a cupboard. "But it's a dangerous time. You know what happened to the Johnson's boy? And the Henderson wagon?" "That wasn't her doing," Bo replied. "You think she had a hand in every sorrow this side of the prairie?" "She's Comanche," one of the men muttered. "Ain't that enough?" The sheriff raised a palm, silencing the others. "No one's saying you meant wrong," Keene said. "But the town stirred up. Tensions are high. You can't expect people to sit quiet knowing there's arrangements like this going on out here." Bo's jaw worked, teeth tight. "There is no arrangement." "Then why is she here?" the woman snapped. "Why does she sleep in your home, where your clothes eat your bread?" "Because she nearly died and no one else gave a damn," Bo said, voice steady, low, like a storm beneath a lake. Keene shifted in the saddle. "Look, Coulter, you know the rules. A woman in a man's house, especially one not his kin, puts us all in a bind. You think folks won't talk? Won't twist it into something worse? There's children in that town, old folks. They're scared. So now I marry her or turn her out?" Bo said quietly. "That your idea of justice?" "No one's forcing anything," Keene replied, though even he sounded tired of the lie. "But if she's to stay, it ought to be proper." The gray-haired woman nodded sharply. "For her sake. And yours." Silence settled like ash. The wind had gone still, the trees holding their breath. Juanilla stepped out from the doorway. She didn't walk with haste or fear. Her chin was high, her eyes calm. She wore the same flannel shirt and long skirt she'd patched herself. She looked like the prairie carved into human shape, weathered but unyielding. "If he marries me," she said softly, "will you leave him be?" The words rolled out rough, but clear. She spoke in their tongue, the one they could understand. It held no apology. Keene looked surprised. The woman nodded once. "You'll be under his name. It'll settle things." Bo turned to Juanilla. "You don't have to." "I know," she said, not looking at him. "But it will give us peace. And peace is something we can build on." He didn't answer right away. His heart beat loud behind his ribs. Then he stepped forward and said, "If this is what it takes to keep her safe, so be it." They didn't hold a church service. No preacher rode out. The town kept its distance, but the sheriff served as witness. The gray-haired woman murmured a few holy lines from memory. Juanilla said nothing, but nodded when Bo spoke her name. He didn't touch her, not even her hand. Afterward, they stood alone on the porch. The riders turned and left without much fanfare. Just like that, the decision was made. The page turned. The sun slipped lower in the sky. Inside, the fire burned low. Juanilla sat by it, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. Bo stood by the window, watching the trail fade beneath dusk's brush. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. She looked at the flames. "I know. Then why?" "Because you gave me my life back, and I want you to keep it safe." He moved to sit across from her. "It's not a real marriage." "Not yet," she said. "But maybe something real will come from it." He didn't speak, but he felt something stir inside him. Not love, not desire, not yet, but something older than both. A tenderness without direction. A recognition. The snow returned the next morning, soft, flurried, barely more than a breath. Juanilla planted seeds in small boxes on the windowsill, talking to them as if they were old friends. Bo mended the fence where the wind had knocked it crooked. They did not call each other husband or wife, but the space between them no longer bristled. They shared bread, laughter, and long silences that comforted more than words. At night, they sometimes fell asleep beside the fire, her shoulder brushing his, both too tired to move, too at ease to care. One evening, as coyotes cried in the far-off dark, she looked at him and said, "They think names make us real." He met her gaze. "What do you think?" "I think kindness makes us more than names." And he believed her. Spring would come slow, with its own troubles. But for now they had quiet. They had warmth. They had names the town gave them, and something deeper that had no name at all. Not yet. But it was growing. The days softened. Light clung longer to the porch rails, and the snow retreated inch by inch, revealing the stubborn shapes of earth that had held fast beneath its weight. Trees were the first signs of leaf blush, not green exactly, but a hopeful brown. The cabin, that quiet sentinel of so many half-spoken things, now breathed easier. Within its walls, routines no longer felt borrowed but earned. Juanilla began spending more time in the garden patch behind the shed. She cleared out old roots with hands both delicate and certain. The way she moved reminded Bo of someone who'd lived in cycles, harvests, seasons, migrations. He watched her through the window some mornings, how her hair lifted in the breeze, how she stooped to press seed into soil like it was a sacred promise. They spoke more now, but not much. Words still came like creek water in spring, hesitant, then suddenly deep. "You ever plant tobacco?" she asked one morning, fingering a satchel of dried leaves she'd kept folded under her bedroll. "No," he said. "Didn't seem right without someone to use it for ceremony." Her hands paused. "Maybe now there is." They didn't look at each other when they said such things. Eye contact had become a tender risk. The quiet between them had shifted. Where once it stood like a wall, it now stretched like a hammock, something held between them, soft and giving. She no longer jumped when he came near. He no longer held himself so rigid in her presence. He built her a bench beneath the cottonwood tree near the fence. Didn't say why. Just whittled the wood smooth and oiled it with care. When she found it, she ran her hand across the grain and whispered something in Comanche. He didn't ask for a translation. Later that day, she baked bread with wild onions and hung damp linens on the line. The cabin smelled of rising dough and clean air. He walked in with his sleeves rolled and mud on his boots, and for a moment, the world tilted toward something that could almost be called home. Then came the fire. It struck just after twilight. A bolt from the sky, sudden and wild, cleaved through the dark and found dry timber. The barn lit up like paper, flames licking skyward with a hunger that made the world feel small. Bo heard the crack before he saw the glow, and by the time he burst through the door, the orange was already bleeding through the window glass. Juanilla was outside before him, hair unbound, skirt whipped by wind. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She moved with the purpose of someone who'd lost enough in life to know what mattered now. They fought the fire together, side by side, breathless and muddy. He filled buckets from a well, and she carried them, soaked and shivering. Embers jumped like fleas, biting at their boots. Smoke clawed down their throats. A beam collapsed, splitting open the night with sparks. Juanilla's sleeve caught. For one wild second, flame curled up her arm like a snake. Bo dropped the bucket and tackled her to the earth, rolling her until the fire hissed out. She coughed, sputtered, shoved him off. But her eyes, those dust-colored eyes, held no fear, only defiance. "You all right?" he rasped, voice raw. She nodded, sitting up. "You." He blinked, realized his palm was blistering, skin red and bubbling. He hadn't noticed. "Fine," he said, breath heaving. "We stopped it." The barn smoldered, gutted. Nothing left but scorched ribs. The horses had already been moved to the pen earlier that evening, as if fate had decided not to be cruel that night. Rain came just after midnight, late but not useless. It fell gentle over ash and ruin, over their clothes and faces. They sat on the porch, soaked through, steam rising from their shoulders. No words, only breath, only the sound of rain forgiving what fire had taken. In the hours that followed, something softened between them further, like flame had scalded away the last skin of doubt. The next morning, she tended to his hand with salve and bandages. Her touch was slow, her eyes focused. He didn't flinch. "You should have let me burn," she said. He frowned. "Why would I do that?" "Because saving me hurts you." He shook his head. "I don't mind the hurt. I just mind the thought of losing you." Her hands paused over his wrist. "You don't even know me." "I know how you look when you're planting," he said. "I know your favorite tea is the mint that grows near the shed. I know you hum when you're scared. I know you keep one eye on the door even when you're smiling." She blinked slowly. "You listen too much." "Only to you." That evening, they sat beneath the cottonwood tree. The bench he'd built groaned gently beneath them. She handed him a string of dried beads and feathers, tokens of her people, she explained. Offerings for protection. He ran his fingers over them, marveling at their simplicity. She told him more of her past that night. Not all of it, but enough. Of her sisters taken. Of her brother shot near the Kansas line. Of the days she wandered, hiding in brush, scraping by, praying the snow wouldn't fall before she found shelter. He didn't cry, but something inside him nodded, a kind of sorrow that had no outlet but staying. "You never wanted to come here," he said quietly. "No," she answered, "but I'm glad I did." When he looked at her, there was no distance left in her gaze, only recognition. Later that week, he carved her a hairpin from the same cedar that had built the bench. She wore it without speaking of it, but he noticed she touched it whenever she passed the window, as though reminding herself she was seen. One morning, they butchered a hen together. She handled the knife. He lit the fire. Neither flinched. They worked like a pair who'd done this all their lives. And maybe, in a way, they had, just not together until now. She laughed once, full and sudden, when the goat headbutted Bo in the knees. He'd cursed and fallen into the mud, and she'd thrown back her head, the sound rising like birds in the air. It was the first time he'd heard that laugh. It startled him. It warmed him. "I forgot I could sound like that," she murmured later, brushing dirt from his shoulder. "You should do it more," he said. The fire that had stolen their barn didn't burn them. If anything, it forged them. Spring began its slow arrival. The earth softened. The hens laid again. Buds pushed from the edges of trees like tiny fists daring the wind to try again. One morning, Bo returned from the creek with a fresh string of fish. When he stepped through the door, he found her standing in the middle of the cabin, one hand on the table, the other on her chest. "I had a dream," she said. "We were old. You were carving something, and I was planting beans." He set the fish down. "Was it a good dream?" She nodded. It felt like the truth. He crossed the floor slowly, not reaching, not assuming. "Juania," he said, "you don't owe me your life, or your name, or your dreams." She looked up at him, face soft but strong. "I don't owe you. I choose you." And in that quiet, unlit room, without a preacher or a sheriff or a feathered hat, they made something real. It wasn't sealed in paper. It wasn't spoken in vows. It was in the way he kissed her forehead like it was sacred, in the way she set another plate at the table without asking, in the fire they no longer feared, in the garden blooming with the promise of a second start. Outside, the sun caught the smoke curling from the chimney, And inside, the cabin finally felt like a place not just for shelter, but for staying. The wind returned one morning not as a whisper, but as a cry, wild, sharp, full of old songs the prairie had tried to forget. It swept through the cottonwood, rattling branches and tugging at the wash line. The air tasted of dust and iron, a change on its breath. Bo felt it before he saw the smoke, thin, curling on the horizon like a finger beckoning trouble. Juanilla saw it too. She stood at the cabin threshold, her braid undone, lips pressed into a pale line. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. That kind of smoke didn't come from chimney fires or burn piles. It came from men who rode without good reason. Bo saddled the mule with steady hands, though his jaw was tight. He scanned the sky once more, counting the seconds between wind gusts, watching how the smoke didn't rise. It moved, as if chasing something or someone. By noon, they heard hoofbeats. 6 riders. Not settlers. Not from town. They came hard across the ridge, dusty and lean, guns slung low and eyes narrowed like wolves sniffing blood. The kind of men who survived war not by virtue, but by violence. Bo stepped onto the porch before they reached the gate, his rifle leaning against the doorframe. He didn't lift it. Not yet. The lead rider halted, scanning the cabin, the field, the narrow garden row where green shoots were trying to be brave. "You called her?" the man asked, voice dry and sharp as a dead branch. Bo nodded. "We're looking for a woman. Young. Comanche. Heard she's been hiding out here." Juanilla stepped into view, behind Bo, her presence quiet but certain. She stood straight, arms at her sides, chin high. She wore the same patched flannel, and a skirt dyed in the soft earth tones of her people. Her eyes didn't waver. The man smiled, slow and mean. "Well now, there she is." Bo's voice came low and level. "She ain't yours." "She was," the rider said. "Found her near a canyon east of Sandpoint. Took her fair. She ran before we was done with her." Bo's hand twitched. But still, he did not raise the rifle. "She's a wife now," he said. "Mine." One of the other men chuckled. "That's so." Juanilla's voice cut through the wind. "I was never yours," she said, not to Bo, but to the man on the horse. "You can steal a body, but not a soul. And mine has teeth now." The wind gusted. A door creaked somewhere behind them. The garden leaves shivered. The man spat into the dirt. "Makes no difference. We got claims. Ain't no town law says you can keep what don't belong." "Then you'll have to take her," Bo said. The man's eyes darkened. "We just might." Silence followed, thick as wet wool. Bo stepped forward. Not much, just one pace. Enough to show the line he'd drawn. "You'll ride back the way you came," he said. "Or we'll plant 6 graves by sundown. Your choice." The man's hand twitched toward his belt. Juanilla stepped off the porch. She walked slow, steady, barefoot on cold earth. She moved not like prey, but like a storm walking on 2 legs. Her voice came calm. "You take me now, and the wind will carry your names like curses." The men didn't laugh this time, because there was something in her gaze they didn't know how to meet. Something unburned. Something holy. The wind picked up again, louder now, wailing through the trees. A flock of crows lifted from the far fence line, crying into the sky. The lead rider hesitated. Bo didn't move. His fingers stayed loose near the rifle. Then, with a muttered curse, the man yanked the reins and turned his horse. One by one, the others followed. No words. No fight. Not out of mercy. Out of fear. When the dust cleared, Bo turned to Juanilla. Her shoulders had slumped the moment the last hoofbeat faded. Her breath came ragged now, hands shaking as if only now realizing what they'd just done. He stepped close. He didn't touch her yet. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head. "They'll talk," she whispered. "The town." "Let 'em," he said. "They'll say you risked everything for a woman not worth the fight." He paused. "I didn't do it for a woman," he said. "I did it for you." That night, the wind howled again, but not with a cry of warning. It sounded like a sigh, a release. Inside the cabin, they sat together near the fire, shoulder to shoulder. Her head rested against his. No words passed. They didn't need to. In the weeks that followed, things bloomed. not just in the garden, though the squash came in strong and the beans reached tall, but in how she moved, freer now, in how she laughed, not just once but often, in how she'd reach for his hand while they walked the fence line, or lean into him when they watched the dusk come soft and golden over the hills. The townsfolk never spoke much about what had happened. Some nodded more respectfully when Bo came to the general store. Others averted their eyes. A few old women left canning jars on the porch, unmarked. When Juanilla entered town with him one quiet market morning, no one spoke. But no one stopped her either. A small boy, maybe 7, stared at her with wide eyes. She knelt and gave him a small carved horse from her apron pocket. He smiled. That was enough. In early June, Juanilla stood barefoot in the grass, eyes closed, palms lifted as if greeting the sky. She wore a new dress she'd made herself, faded blue with stitching like waves at the hem. Her belly was flat. Her smile was not. Bo watched from the porch, the wind tugging gently at his sleeves. She turned and walked toward him. The wind picked up behind her, swirling around the cabin, catching her skirt and hair like they belonged to it. "You know," she said, stepping close, "the wind used to frighten me." He reached for her hand. "And now, it brought me here." Bo kissed her then, not like a claim, not like a prize, like a promise. The kind that doesn't need words. That night, as they lay wrapped in quilts beneath the rafters, she whispered in the dark, "I used to dream of running. Now I dream of planting." He pulled her close. "You planted something in me, too." "What?" "Hope." And in the quiet that followed, as the fire settled and the wind curled soft against the windows, the world seemed to sigh again. Not with grief, but with peace. The kind that takes root only after flame. The kind you earn, together. The kind where a woman once stolen by men now walks free beside one who saw her not as something to save, but someone to stand beside. The kind of peace that turns cabins into homes, and strangers into what the wind dares call husband and wife. Sam Ward stood at his window, his rough palms resting on the sill as he watched the dusk settle. 45 winters had passed through him, and this one felt the longest yet. His beard was going white at the chin, and his shoulders carried grief like it had weight, which it did. 3 years ago, he'd buried his wife beneath a cottonwood tree that bent toward the creek like it too had broken in two. Since then, Sam had lived in silence, not because he couldn't speak, but because there was no one worth speaking to. The cabin bore the shape of her memory. Her woven shawl still hung on the back of the chair he never sat in. A shelf of dried herbs gathered dust, untouched since her hands last arranged them. He still slept on one side of the bed, though the other had long gone cold. There had been a child once, too, a daughter who'd never taken her first breath. After that, Sam stopped building cradles. He built fences, mended saddles, and kept to himself. The town whispered about the quiet man who rode in once a month and spoke only when coin changed hands. Some said he'd gone mad with grief. Some said he'd always been that way. That night, as the sky bruised into nightfall, he heard it, a sound not belonging to the wind. Faint, halting. He thought it might be a coyote at first, limping across the hard earth. But as he stepped out, shotgun in hand more from habit than threat, he saw her. She lay in the snow beneath the cedar by the barn, curled inward like the wind had carved her hollow. Her dress was torn at the sleeve, and blood soaked the fabric from shoulder to wrist. Barefoot, young, still as the deer he used to hunt in lean years. For a long moment, Sam simply looked at her, unmoving, the way a man stares at something he cannot believe is real. And then he lowered the gun. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask where she came from. He just lifted her with careful arms, as if afraid she might fall apart from the touch. She weighed less than sorrow and carried the scent of river water and smoke. When he crossed the threshold of the cabin, it felt like bringing a storm inside. He laid her near the hearth and wrapped her in the only blanket not steeped in memory. She stirred faintly, her lips dry and cracked, murmuring in a language he didn't speak but felt in his bones. Comanche, maybe. He hadn't seen any of their people near this land in years. Not since the soldiers came through and drove them out in the name of peace. But this girl, no more than 20, had the look of someone running from more than soldiers. He poured a basin of warm water and gently washed the blood from her skin. There was a gash on her arm, deep but not fatal. It had bled enough to weaken her, but the wound was clean. He stitched it with the quiet skill of a man who had once done this for a living. Before the war, before the farm, before everything. She watched him through half-lidded eyes, flinching only once when the needle met flesh. He said nothing. She said nothing back. When he finished, he stepped outside to wash his hands in snow and let the wind clear the weight from his lungs. The moon was rising, casting long shadows on the prairie. He stared at the cedar tree for a long time. It had once been his wife's favorite. She'd planted wildflowers around its base every spring. They never came back after she died. Inside, the girl had curled closer to the fire, asleep now. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Sam stood in the doorway for a while, one hand on the frame, then moved to his chair by the fire and sat. He didn't try to sleep. He didn't watch her either. He just stared at the flames and remembered the last time he'd shared this room with someone else's breath. He told himself she'd be gone by morning. But morning came, and she remained. She woke before the sun did, sitting upright with a sharpness born of fear. Sam had left a piece of cornbread and some jerky on a plate beside her. She reached for it like a trapped animal might, quick, cautious. He sat at the table, drinking coffee, not watching her, but not ignoring her either. When her eyes met his, there was no demand in them, no plea, no gratitude. Just an uneasy truce between strangers. "You're safe here," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "For now." She didn't answer, but she didn't run. The snow thickened that day. Sam tended the livestock, checking fences and breaking the ice in the water trough. He worked slow, methodical as always. When he returned, she had swept the hearth clean and folded the blanket. He noticed her watching the cupboard, the shelves of dry goods. Hunger was a silent thing, but it carved lines in the face just the same. He made a stew that night, beans, salt pork, wild onion. She ate slowly, her movements precise, almost ceremonial. He noticed how she chewed only one side of her mouth and suspected a bruise on the other, hidden beneath her dark hair. He didn't ask who had hurt her. She didn't offer. That night, the storm worsened. The wind howled like a thing grieving its own voice. Sam stoked the fire and gave her the bed. He slept in the chair. It was not a kindness, he told himself. Just practicality. The bed was warmer. She was healing. That was all. In the middle of the night, he woke to find her standing at the window. Her silhouette was sharp against the firelight, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching for something, or someone. He rose slowly. "You expecting trouble?" She turned to him, then really looked at him. There was a long silence, heavy and fragile. Then she nodded. Once. Sam considered that. He had known trouble in many forms: war, hunger, loss. But this felt different. This was not his trouble, yet somehow it had already made its home in his life. He crossed the room and pulled a blanket from a chair. "You'll stay tonight. We'll figure out the rest come morning." She looked at him with something unreadable. Not trust. Not yet. But not fear either. He returned to his chair, leaned his head back, and listened to the crackle of the fire as the wind beat against the walls. Something in him had shifted, though he couldn't name it. The silence no longer felt like morning. When dawn bled through the shutters, pink and pale, Sam stepped outside to feed the horses. He hadn't seen fresh tracks in weeks, but this morning his breath caught. Hoofprints. Dozens. Circling the cabin like a noose. He looked to the ridge and saw them. Riders. Dozens. Maybe more. Painted faces. Spears tipped with sunlight. A figure at their head sat tall in his saddle, cloak whipping like wings. Comanche. Sam's chest tightened, not with fear, but with a cold clarity. He turned slowly back to the house. Inside, the girl stood near the fire, her eyes wide but not surprised. He said nothing. Neither did she. And in that stillness, something passed between them. A quiet understanding that neither was safe, but neither would run. Not anymore. The morning light rose slow and bruised. casting long pink streaks across the snow-covered plains. The air was brittle with cold, sharp enough to sting the lungs, and still enough that every sound carried far. Sam Ward stood outside, one hand on the fence rail, the other holding a dented tin cup of coffee gone lukewarm. He sipped without tasting, his eyes tracking a change in the horizon. He'd been a rancher long enough to know when the world went quiet in the wrong way. The birds hadn't called. No rabbits darted from underbrush. Even the wind had stilled, like the land itself held its breath. Then came the shimmer, barely visible at first. A ripple in the distance. Dust unsettled. The sound came next, the low rhythmic thunder of hooves. He didn't move, not at first. He set the cup down on the fence post with care, as if afraid to wake something ancient. Then he turned and walked toward the cabin, his boots crunching softly in the frostbitten snow. Inside, the girl was standing at the hearth, wrapping a strip of linen tighter around her healing arm. Her hair had been braided back loosely, and there was an alertness in her posture now, not fear, but readiness. "They're here," Sam said. She looked up, and her eyes, already wide, grew distant. He reached for the Winchester above the door, but didn't take it down. His hand paused, then dropped. The rifle wouldn't help him now. He stepped outside again, and this time she followed. The horses came into full view then, cresting the low ridge like a wave of earth and bone and motion. There were dozens, 60, 70 maybe, all mounted, all silent. Their approach was deliberate, not a charge, but a claim. They rode as one, their formation tight and unervingly quiet, the snow muffling even the hoofbeats. At their head was a man draped in a cloak made of black wolf fur, his face painted with streaks of red that ran like war tears down his cheeks. His horse was the only one adorned with feathers, braided into its mane and tail, each one stained with ochre and ash. His expression was unreadable, carved from old stone and darker knowledge. He stopped a dozen yards from the cabin, and the others formed a wide, circling ring behind him, surrounding the house without raising a single weapon. The girl stepped forward before Sam could speak. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. "Father," she said. The man on the horse said nothing. His gaze passed over her, then landed on Sam. Sam remained still, arms loose at his sides, feet planted. He didn't speak. There was no point in explaining something neither man had words for. He only watched, trying to understand what this father saw. A broken-spirited white man with a cabin full of ghosts, standing next to his only daughter. The silence dragged long enough for the wind to return, brushing along the edges of the gathering like a breath, trying to revive a fire. Then the father spoke, his voice a low, solemn rumble. "You sheltered her." It wasn't a question. Sam gave a slow nod. The Comanche leader dismounted, snow creaking beneath his boots. He walked forward with calm authority, the way some men walked into battle or prayer. When he stopped, he was only a few paces from Sam, close enough to strike, close enough to see the lines of sleeplessness etched into each other's faces. The girl stepped between them. She chose not to return, she said quietly, but with a kind of certainty that needed no raising. The warriors didn't move, nor did Sam. The father's eyes, dark and ancient, flicked toward his daughter, then back to Sam. "She crossed into death," he said, "and you gave her breath again." "I didn't give her anything," Sam answered. "She took it back herself." The girl's father studied him for a long moment, something shifting, not softening, but recalibrating. A measure of the man before him. His hand rose slowly. Sam tensed, but it was only to touch the girl's chin. "You are not a child," he said to her, "and still I hope to decide for you." She didn't flinch. "I did not run from you. I ran from men who took more than they had a right to." That hit the air like thunder without sound. The leader looked away then, toward the open prairie behind Sam's homestead. The past stretched out there, tangled with blood, treaty, silence, and sorrow. He turned back to Sam. "My warriors will not strike today." Relief, subtle and swift, passed through the girl's shoulders, but Sam didn't relax. He heard the unsaid part. "But they may return," the father continued. "Not in peace. You have 3 days. Then I come not as a father, but as a chief." He mounted again in a fluid movement. No dramatic turn. No shouted command. The circle of warriors slowly turned with him, their horses moving like tidewater pulled by an unseen moon. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving only churned snow and the thud of retreating hooves behind. Sam stood watching until even the last silhouette vanished into horizon haze. He exhaled then, not deeply, just enough to feel the breath leave his body. Inside, the cabin had grown cold. The fire had dipped low. He tossed more wood onto it, sparks jumping like startled birds. The girl sat at the edge of the bed now, her face unreadable. "You should go with them," Sam said, not unkindly. She looked up. "And go where? Back to silence? Back to marrying some man who sees me only as a name on a treaty?" He had no answer. She added almost softly, "You gave me a room that didn't lock. That was enough." He busied himself with the fire again, not because it needed tending, but because he couldn't look at her too long without feeling something shift beneath the skin. He didn't know what to do with it yet. 3 days. He counted them like grains in an hourglass, each one a chance to lose her or keep her. Later that evening, as the wind howled across the chimney mouth, Sam sat by the window, a mug in his hand and his heart wandering too close to places he'd long avoided. She was across the room, weaving a strip of leather into something that might become a pouch or might become a story. Her hands moved with purpose, like she'd done this all her life, like making something new was a quiet way of reclaiming something old. He watched her from the corner of his eye, not out of desire, not yet, but out of wonder. Of all the people to find his doorstep, why her? Why now? She caught him watching, didn't smile, didn't look away. "You don't fear them," she said. "No." "Why?" "I've already lost what most men fear to lose." She nodded slowly. "I have not. But I've nearly." The fire snapped. Outside, a coyote yipped in the distance. Sam looked toward the sound, but said nothing. "I won't ask you to keep me," she said, voice low. "But I won't leave unless you make me." He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't soft in the way his wife had been. She didn't carry lightness or easy laughter. She carried storm silence and the stubborn root of something growing in scorched ground. He didn't tell her to leave. He didn't say she could stay. He just stood and stoked the fire again, and she returned to her weaving, and the world turned one breath closer to whatever came next. Outside, the tracks of 70 horses remained etched into the snow, a warning, a promise, or perhaps a mark left by fate's own hand. And somewhere in Sam's chest, something long dormant began to stir, quiet as the wind before it sings. The next morning arrived muted and pale, a sky the color of linen stretched thin over the horizon. The snow hadn't melted, but it had softened, the brittle edge of winter momentarily dulled. Sam Ward stepped out into the hush, the weight of the Comanche chief's words like stones in his coat pocket. 2 days remained. He busied himself in the way of men who have more thoughts than they know what to do with. Feed the horse. Check the tack. Mend the coop wire. The girl moved through the cabin like a ghost turned tangible, her touch light, her steps careful, but never timid. He noticed how she took to small tasks without being asked. She swept the hearth, cleaned his tin plates, folded blankets, and once, after dusk, refilled the woodpile with an armful she'd gathered herself. They still spoke little. Words between them were chosen sparingly, like water in drought. But the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was something softer, a room both of them stood inside. She asked for his wife's name. That was the first time her voice came with intention. "Marjorie," Sam said, quiet as snow falling. She didn't say more. But later that day, he noticed she'd placed the old shawl, the one Marjorie used to wear while baking, neatly folded at the foot of the bed. She'd taken the one from the back of the chair instead. He watched her more now, not with hunger or heat, but with a steady, unsettled curiosity. The girl was younger than the years written into her eyes. There was a silence in her, yes, but it wasn't empty. It was shaped like someone who had listened long before she was ever allowed to speak. She had a way of watching animals that reminded him of Marjorie, head tilted slightly, like trying to understand their language. One morning, he found her crouched near the coop, holding out a scrap of biscuit to the hen who'd once pecked his palm raw. The bird took it gently from her hand. He passed her a length of leather later that day, supple and sun-darkened, and said, "Thought you might want to make something from it." She nodded, then looked him in the eye and said, "Thank you." The words landed softly, but with weight. In the evenings, they sat by the fire, close but never touching. She sang once, not loudly, not for him, a low lullaby in Comanche, full of sand and wind and smoke. He didn't ask what the words meant. Some things were not meant to be translated. Instead, he listened. He began to speak again, piece by piece. Not stories, not yet. Just fragments. She learned he had once been a medic in the war, the one where brother turned on brother, and fields bloomed red. He told her he came west not for gold, but because the silence here suited him. She asked no questions, and he liked that about her. One evening, as dusk bruised the edge of the sky, he returned from town with supplies. Miss Lottie, the storekeep, had eyed him strangely when he bought fabric and tea. Her mouth had pursed when he asked for an extra tin cup. "You've got company, Sam?" she asked, her tone sharper than the question warranted. "I've got someone passing through," he replied. She squinted. "Company's not always good company." "She's not trouble," he said. "She's a Comanche girl," Lottie whispered, as though the word might curdle if spoken aloud. "They've got a way of turning even quiet men wild." Sam had paid and left without another word. That night, he brought out the fabric and laid it on the table without fanfare. The girl looked at it for a long time before reaching out and touching it. Just a faint brush of her fingers over the blue cotton. She didn't speak, but her expression held something close to gratitude. The next morning, he found her stitching it into a tunic, handwork, so precise it could have been done by a machine. She worked by the fire, sunlight glinting off the needle. She looked calm, but her eyes flicked often to the window. Sam noticed. "You expecting them back before tomorrow?" She nodded. "They won't wait." He didn't ask if she was afraid. Later, as the wind picked up and the clouds rolled in low, Sam saddled his mare and rode to the canyon ridge that overlooked the trail. He saw nothing, not yet, but he felt it. The weight of what was coming. The tension in the air had teeth. When he returned, the cabin smelled of broth. She'd used what he'd brought, dried beans, carrot, a strip of pork. She gestured for him to sit, ladled out 2 bowls, and placed them on the table. It was the first time they shared a meal that felt like communion rather than survival. Afterward, he stood beside the hearth, watching the fire chew its way through kindling. She stood behind him. Not close, not touching, but there. "I dreamed of a river last night," she said. "Back home. I was small again. My mother washed my hair in the shallows. I hadn't thought of her in years." He turned just slightly. "She gone?" She nodded. "Sick in the winter. No medicine." His throat worked around words that never came. "You remind me of her," she said. "You listen the way she did. Like every silence is a sentence you're still learning to read." He didn't know what to do with that, so he said what he could. "You're not what I expected. Neither are you." They didn't speak after that. But something opened. Something shifted. The next day, he showed her how to shape rawhide into reins, how to knot them strong enough to hold against a pulling horse. She taught him a different kind of knot, the kind used to bind sinew to arrow shafts. They worked beside one another in the yard as wind curled between them, scattering curls of hay and snow. It felt like building something. It felt like language. That evening, she braided his horse's mane, humming under her breath. He watched her hands, watched the way her fingers moved, nimble, precise, deliberate. She looked up once, catching him staring, and smiled. Just the smallest curve of her lips. It undid something in him. She stayed by the fire longer that night. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't move either. When she leaned her head against the edge of his chair, her hair brushing his arm, he didn't pull away. They sat like that, 2 shadows stitched together by warmth. He wanted to speak. He wanted to say, "I don't know what this is, but it's more than silence." He wanted to tell her about the dreams he'd started having again, of holding his daughter, of Marjorie laughing in the spring wind. But he didn't. The next morning, there were tracks in the snow again. Not near the house. Not yet. But close enough. The time had narrowed. He watched her from the porch. She stood by the cedar tree, hand on its trunk, her eyes closed. She looked like someone saying goodbye. "You think they'll take you?" he asked when she came back inside. "They'll try. I could leave. Ride with you. Get you past the ridge." She shook her head. "You run. They'll chase harder. They'll think you took me." That it was about conquest, not choice. His jaw clenched. "And if I tell them otherwise? They won't believe you. Not at first. You're not one of them. You're not one of us." He stared at her, the fire crackling behind him. "Then who are we?" She looked at him, and her eyes, dark, fierce, wounded, held something tender. "Maybe we're the language between." That night, the storm came again, but not with snow. With wind and dust, and a sky full of restless clouds. They sat close by the fire, knees nearly touching, breath sinking in slow rhythm. He told her then, finally, about his daughter, about the tiny grave beneath the cottonwood, and how he couldn't bring himself to name her, because naming something meant believing it had lived. She took his hand, held it. Her fingers were rougher than Marjorie's had been, but warmer, stronger. "I think she lived," she said, "even if only in your dreams." He couldn't answer. He wanted to kiss her, but didn't. Not yet. The moment asked only for nearness. They slept in the same room that night, him in the chair, her on the bed, but neither of them truly slept. The air was too full waiting. In the dark he whispered, "What's your name?" "Nahili." He tasted it. Let it settle on his tongue. Nahili. She breathed in like she hadn't heard it said like that in years. Outside, the wind shifted, and morning, the final morning, waited just beyond the edge of sleep. The morning broke without color, a sky stretched thin with ash and wind. The land had changed overnight. It no longer felt like a quiet place. It felt like a drum skin stretched too tight, ready to snap. The air was restless, each gust tugging at the corners of the world, like unseen hands testing for weakness. Sam stood at the edge of the porch, a worn wool blanket around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the horizon. There was no need to guess anymore. The Comanche would return today. The line had been drawn, not with words but with silence, with hooves that circled a home and eyes that burned without ever raising a voice. Inside, Nahili moved with slow precision, her face unreadable. She braided her hair back tightly, tied her tunic with leather cord, and checked the stitching along the bandage on her arm. She dressed not as a girl waiting to be rescued, but as someone bracing for what would come, whatever form it took. Sam watched her through the doorway. He wanted to ask her what she planned to do, but part of him already knew. She hadn't come here for safety. She'd stayed for freedom. And now that the choice stood sharpened and waiting, she would face it, not flee from it. He made coffee, though his hands shook just enough to spill a few drops across the counter. She joined him at the table, and for a time they just sat, two people surrounded by quiet, trying to memorize the stillness before it vanished. She spoke first. "They will want me to return, not just because I am daughter to a chief, but because I left without permission. They see me as belonging." "You don't," Sam said softly, "belong to anyone." Her eyes met his. "That is not how they see it. A woman taken or sheltered is a woman claimed. They will not ask why you helped me. They will assume they already know." He looked down at his calloused hands. "Then we tell them. They may not listen. Then we make them." She looked at him as if seeing something deeper beneath his quiet, not stubbornness, but resolve forged from sorrow. She reached across the table and placed her fingers over his. They stayed there for a long time. By noon, the clouds had gathered thick and low, swelling with a storm that had no name. The wind dragged dust across the ground in curls, whispering warnings against the cabin walls. The first rumble of thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from the earth, the hooves returning. Sam stepped outside again. He had oiled the rifle that morning, but left it leaning inside the door. It wouldn't help him today. This was not a fight of bullets or steel. This was something older. The horses came in tighter this time. No circle. Just a line across the field, a wall of riders dressed in war paint and silence. At their center stood Chief Navo, his wolf-cloaked shoulders broad as ever, but his expression drawn. His gaze found Nahili as soon as she stepped outside. She did not hide behind Sam. She stood beside him, eyes steady, spine straight. Navo raised a hand, and the warriors behind him dismounted. Still no weapons drawn, but the weight of intention hung heavy, as thick as the storm clouds above. "You have had your days," Navo said. "Now she returns." "She is not property," Sam replied. "She is daughter," Navo answered. "That is not ownership. That is bond. And when a bond is broken, something dies." Nahili took a step forward. Her voice was steady, each word deliberate. "Then let it die if it was built on silence." That caused a murmur among the warriors. Navo's jaw tensed. "You speak like one who forgets blood. I speak like one who has seen what happens when blood is all that binds." Navo approached now, his eyes burning into hers. "You would stay with a man who does not know our ways? Who cannot speak to our dead? Who will never walk the path you were born into?" "I would stay with a man who let me be," she said. "Who saw me before he needed me to be anything." Navo's eyes turned to Sam, and for a long drawn moment, father and widower stood again in that unspoken crossing. No man raised his voice. No man moved. "You took her," Navo said. "I opened a door," Sam answered. "She walked through it. You love her." The words settled in the space between wind and silence. Sam looked to Nahili, and then back. "I lost everything I loved. And still, I wouldn't ask her to stay unless she wanted to." Navo turned his face slightly, as if listening for something else beneath the words. Then, slowly, he unhooked a blade from his belt, a ceremonial knife, old and etched with weathered carvings. He stepped forward and held it out, not as threat, but as offering. "A man does not win a daughter," he said. "He proves whether he will break under her weight or carry it with honor." Sam looked at the knife, but didn't take it. Navo continued, "We have a right. You will hunt with me. One deer, one path. If you walk it without flinching, then I will know what kind of man you are." Sam said nothing for a moment, then nodded once. Nahili touched his hand as he turned to go, her grip neither desperate nor pleading, just warm, present. The men rode out together, chief and rancher, into the low hills, where the sagebrush grew thick and the trees broke the wind. The deer they found was not old, nor young, a buck with eyes wide and ears keen. Navo motioned to Sam, offering him the chance. Sam took the bow, the same one Nahili had strung days earlier, and moved through the brush like he had during war. He did not rush. He did not force the moment. When he loosed the arrow, it struck just behind the shoulder, clean and true. They brought the deer back as the rain finally began to fall, not hard, but steady, like something long held back had been released. The warriors stood waiting, their expressions unreadable. Navo dismounted and stood before Sam again. "You do not speak like us," he said. "You do not know our words, but your actions say what your mouth does not." Then, without ceremony, he turned to Nahili. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, "but you are not gone from my heart." He touched her forehead with 2 fingers, then turned and walked to his horse. The warriors mounted. No battle came. No blood spilled. Just departure. Just rain. When the sound of hooves faded again into the waiting horizon, Sam and Nahili stood alone in the quiet. The storm did not howl. It wept. They entered the cabin in silence. She removed her wet tunic and wrapped herself in one of Marjorie's old shawls, and he hung his coat to dry. The fire hissed where the logs were damp, but the warmth held steady. She approached him slowly, her hands bare, her eyes raw. "You didn't flinch," she said. "Didn't know I had the choice. I was ready to leave. I would have let you." She stepped closer, and he let her. There was no trembling now, no breath held back. "I want to stay," she said. He reached out, touched her cheek. Her skin was damp from the rain, but warm. "Then stay," he said, as if there was nothing else in the world more simple or more sacred. And in that moment, the storm passed. Later, he would remember the way the rain hit the roof like a lullaby, and how her fingers found is not in urgency, but in quiet trust. They did not speak of forever. They spoke only in touches, in glances, in breaths shared beneath the shadow of thunderclouds now drifting away. Outside, the tracks of the horses filled slowly with water. The fire inside crackled. And the two people who had been lost, not from the world, but from themselves, began to root again, together, in soil softened by rain. The sun rose slow and honey gold, warming the frost that clung to the tall prairie grass. For the first time in weeks, the sky was clear, blue as a newborn's eyes, wide as a breath long held and finally let go. The storm had passed, not only in the sky, but between them. The wind had stilled. The danger was gone. Sam Ward stood by the barn with a bucket in one hand and a worn bridle slung over his shoulder. His coat was patched at the elbows and speckled with hay, but his posture had shifted, less like a man weighed down and more like a man rooted. Behind him, the cabin no longer looked like a tomb. Smoke rose from the chimney in a clean, steady ribbon. Inside, Nahili moved through the morning light, barefoot, her hair braided down her back in a single dark rope. She didn't hum as she worked. That wasn't her way. But there was rhythm in her now, a kind of steadiness that hadn't been there before. She chopped herbs, folded linen, and carried water without hesitation. Each movement was her own, chosen freely. There was no fear in her hands anymore. Sam watched her from the window as she spread a blanket out to dry. The shawl she wore was no longer his wife's. It had been stitched with new edges, a strip of the blue cloth he'd bought in town sewn into the hem. Her creation now, her life woven in, the past respected, not replaced. He turned from the window and picked up the small bundle near the hearth. Inside it was a necklace, 3 carved bone beads on a leather thong, the kind his own mother had worn when he was a child. He held it for a long moment, thumb brushing over the center bead, before placing it carefully on the table where Nahili would find it. A gift. Nothing grand. Just a gesture that said, I see you. I choose you. Wordless offerings had become their language. Outside, the road stretched toward town, dusty and sun-baked now, its memory of snow fading. There was a matter that needed tending, one that couldn't be delayed. Sam saddled the horse, and Nahili stepped onto the porch, wrapping her shawl tighter. She said nothing at first, but her brow furrowed slightly. You're riding into town, she said. He nodded. They'll have questions about why the Comanche came and left without blood. She studied him. You'll tell them. I'll tell them what they need to hear. She looked past him toward the horizon. They won't believe it. They'll believe what they want. They always do. A pause. You want me to stay behind? She asked, though her tone made it clear she wasn't afraid of following. Sam hesitated. I want you to do what you choose. She looked at the horse, then back at him. Then I choose to ride with you. He helped her mount, not out of chivalry, but because he wanted to. Her fingers brushed his wrist as she settled into the saddle, and he felt the charge of her trust. They rode side by side, the wind tugging gently at their coats, the hooves striking earth with a rhythm that felt like heartbeat and promise. As they neared town, Sam straightened his shoulders. He could already feel the weight of eyes. Townsfolk noticed things, especially when a Comanche woman rode in beside a man like him, quiet, scarred, too old for anything as foolish as hope. They dismounted outside Miss Lottie's store. She was already standing in the doorway, arms crossed, lips pressed thin. Her gaze went first to Nahili, then to Sam, then to the distance, as if trying to fit the pieces into a story she could live with. Well, Lottie said. You brought her back then. Sam met her stare. She's not cargo, Lottie. Didn't say she was. The older woman's gaze flicked again to Nahili. Though I don't think the good folk in town will take kindly to this arrangement. Nahili stepped forward before Sam could speak. Her voice was calm, but her words cut clean. I am not an arrangement. I am a woman who chose. Lottie blinked. Something in her bristled, but she didn't reply. She only stepped aside as they entered. Inside, the store smelled of dust and cinnamon. A few townspeople paused their browsing. A hush spread like ink and water. Sam kept his chin up, hands loose at his sides. He didn't look to Nahili. He didn't need to. Her presence steadied him like earth beneath the wind. They picked up what they needed: flour, a bit of sugar, coffee beans. At the counter, Lottie rang up the goods in silence. Before they left, Sam said, "We'll be married come spring." The words were quiet, but every soul in the store heard them. A murmur ran through the room, like wind through dry grass. Nahili didn't flinch. She turned and walked out, leaving behind only the scent of sage from the bundle tied at her belt. Outside, Sam exhaled, not in relief, but in resolve. That had been the storm he'd feared more than any blade or bullet, the storm of judgment, of whispers, of history trying to claim them. But it hadn't won. They rode home slow, the sun lowering behind them in gold and rust. A hawk circled overhead, wings wide against the light. Nahili tilted her face to the wind. Her eyes were distant, but not lost. When they reached the cabin, the light was deep amber. Sam unsaddled the horse while Nahili walked to the cedar tree, fingers trailing along its trunk. The same one she'd collapsed beneath weeks ago. The same one that had marked a kind of death. Now it stood at the edge of something entirely different. That night, the fire burned low and rich. Nahili sat at the table, fingers working a new braid into a length of leather, the ends looped for reins. Sam watched her from his chair, one boot resting on the hearthstone, a mug cradled in his hands. "Will you miss them?" he asked. She looked up. "My people." He nodded. She thought for a while. "Some. Not all. I miss who I was before they told me what I had to be." Sam stared into the fire. "I know that feeling." She stood, cross to him, and placed her hands on either side of his face. "You never told me what you wanted." He looked up at her, his eyes lined but steady. "I wanted peace, but I didn't know what that meant until you walked through my door." She kissed him then, not the tentative kind born of curiosity, or the fiery kind born of want. It was a kiss that settled into him, anchoring something that had floated too long. A kiss that made room for silence after. In the days that followed, they built a new rhythm. She began carving again, shapes into bone, into antler. He repaired the fence with her beside him, their hands brushing often. He taught her to shoot a rifle. She taught him to track rabbit by the way snow bent in footprints. They spoke often now, not because silence no longer served them, but because there was joy in sharing it too. The town's eyes softened over time. Not everyone, but some. Miss Lottie began setting aside fabric Nahili might like. A boy from the nearby farm asked her to show him how to weave arrow fletchings. The world didn't change overnight, but it bent quietly, like grass beneath new wind. One evening, Sam sat by the fire with a cradle in his lap. He carved it slow, careful, the same way he once had for a child who never opened her eyes. This one was different. This one was for the life blooming in the curve of Nahili's belly. She leaned against the doorway, watching him work, her hands cradling herself like a prayer already answered. "You're different," she said. He looked up. "How so?" "Lighter. Like your shadow doesn't cling so hard." He chuckled softly. "Might be because I don't carry it alone anymore." Outside, the stars spilled across the prairie sky, fierce and infinite. The fire crackled. The baby kicked. The man carved. And the woman who had been hunted and silenced and claimed stood unbroken, beloved, chosen. In the stillness between breaths, Sam whispered, "Some stories begin with fire, some with ash. But ours began the moment I opened that door." Nahili crossed to him, placed her hand over his heart, and whispered back, "And I walked in." And so they remained, two quiet souls who had once lived in storms, now wrapped in firelight and building a life not of conquest, but of consent. Not of rescue, but of recognition. They had endured the long ride. They had made it home, together.